more like it's a backpacker lodge in a small hotel in eastern Zimbabwe. And my parents found themselves on the front line of basically a civil war. There are many generations in Africa. My father has Dutch and Huguenot roots, and I've been in Africa since his ancestry goes back to the late 1600s. And my mother since the 1820s in Africa. So many generations of people, whenever they see a white person from Africa, they always assume that you're an expatriate or a colonialist. And what I sort of would go back to do and write stories about this country that was falling apart was tell the story about this dictatorship and this terrible economic catastrophe which was taking place in Zimbabwe. And the more I did that, the more I realized there was a story that wasn't being told to American Western audiences, to these readers of the papers I was writing for the magazines. They all knew this story, but there was something else happening. And I saw it in my parents, and I saw it in the people around them, on the relationships that they had to build to survive what was happening. And they went through this crazy period where their backpacker lodge ran out of business. There were no tourists coming to Zimbabwe anymore. And what developed there was effectively like an informal brothel. And I was horrified that this was the way my parents were leasing this out to a local businessman. And finding out that he had effectively turned it into a bar where prostitutes would come. I was horrified by this and told my parents, and they sort of looked at me and said, you know what, how else are we going to make a living in this country? And a few weeks later on the same trip, I discovered that my father was growing a little marijuana plantation at the age of 70 in my mother's rose garden. And I said the same thing, you know, we've got to try and sort of get businesses going. And then they'd established these relationships with Zimbabweans who are black Zimbabweans who have been going through exactly the same experience, trying to survive a dictatorship. And they established amazing relationships. And what I ended up writing was almost a dark comedy about surviving in Africa that was not the narrative that we always read about, and the narrative that President Mugabe or the ruling party want you to think about, which is about race and it's about colonialism. So this was, in their view, and in many of our Western eyes, Africa is also about racism or colonial injustice. Okay? So I ended up writing a dark comedy about people surviving and getting beyond race. And I came to the conclusion that although I didn't want to live in this country, I was full of admiration for my parents and the friends around them and people of Zimbabwe who, in the last 3 or 4 elections, have effectively voted out this president in democratic elections, in proper elections, but have been ignored or overruled, and incredible violence that takes place. But every time there is this amazing democratic process from most Zimbabweans who don't want to have a war and are prepared to go down to a ballot box and put their X for an opposition leader or for another leader. And as brutalized as they are, they keep doing it. And there's another election that'll take place in July in Zimbabwe, and the same thing will happen. And I ended up writing a story that was almost a comedy, but an optimistic story about Zimbabwe. And although I didn't want to live there, strange things happened since the book came out. A friend of mine in New York, an American guy who's a banker at Goldman Sachs, resigned in sort of disgust at what had happened on Wall Street, and announced to me that he was leaving America and he was going to move to Africa. And I thought, are you crazy? And sure enough, he packed up with his family and moved to Harare. And he said, this is where opportunities are. Africa is this last frontier. And what Ed's just been talking about macro and micro differences. I'm going to talk, for me, Africa is about the micro. I don't know enough about the politics of these countries, and I realize that many African countries are only now emerging from dictatorship and very poor rule, but they are emerging from them. In December, there were 2, in Kenya and Ghana, there were televised election debates, televised presidential debates in Kenya and Ghana, and millions of people tuned into this. A country like Kenya, they have, I don't know the exact, I think the Economist piece you were quoting, that says everyone has a cell phone. It's something like 75% of the population have a cell phone, and they bank online. They use cell phones to do banking. There's an area of Kenya, well, it's in central Nairobi, which is called the iHub, where you get these young guys, this new generation, and what an economist called George Ayite has called the cheetah generation. And he says this young generation of Africans who are now tired of dictatorship, many of them have studied or worked in the West, and have come back with new ideas, and are subverting and going around the bureaucracy and the oppression and the regulations that these governments, what he calls the hippo generation, the leadership, are imposing on the people.